Next, our cover story on WA Incorporated. Be amazed by this next story.
9 seconds. 5, 3, 2.
Last Tuesday, the Deputy Premier of Victoria resigned, forced from office over the mismanagement of more than $100 million of taxpayers' money by the Government Development Corporation. In Western Australia, several times as much public money may have been lost in questionable business ventures, but political resignations, not a one. Nor was the matter deemed worthy of address by Labor Premier Peter Dowding until the dying days of his campaign for yesterday's state election in Western Australia. It was only the tiresome but tireless curiosity of Eastern journalists that forced onto his agenda the issue of WA Inc., the network of privilege and patronage that is the subject of our cover story. It's reported by Helen Dalley, who joins us this year from Business Sunday.
Past a maximum of 24 degrees. This is ABC News. It's 7:10.
Those who came on convict ships were told you...
For our special Australia Day program, we have some very special guests. We have Peter Dowding. Good morning to you, Mr. Dowding.
Good morning, Ted.
This is politics in Western Australia, parochial, jingoistic, illustrating the small-town mentality that works in this state and seems to work with voters.
I now know of shorts and thongs and of stubbies versus cans, the Aussie Constitution and the true blue Aussie man.
It's hard to imagine another state in Australia where an election campaign that's been so close would be so casual, so laid back. There's not much difference in issues between the two candidates, Labor's Peter Dowding and the Liberals' Barry McKinnon, although there's a world of difference in their personal popularity. Superficially, at least, Dowding is a natural smoothie, not to mention the help he had from the big guns in Canberra. But the one festering sore that closed the gap between the government and opposition, and is a scandalous embarrassment for Labor, is what has become known as WA Incorporated.
You don't really have a say in this state anymore. Your future's being shaped by the super rich and some very powerful Labor politicians.
WA Inc. is the name given to the incestuous ties and deals between Labor or its agencies and a few favoured entrepreneurs. In the end, taxpayers in the West will lose up to $400 million. That's roughly 10% of the entire state budget. The Liberals claim it amounts to $1,300 per family in WA.
Somebody needs to crack this government open to put power back where it belongs with the people.
It became such an embarrassment that in the campaign's final days, Peter Dowding had to face up to the issue.
But the decisions that I have made, I have stuck to, and I've accepted full responsibility for them. And I understand that there are people in the state who have decided that we need a kick in the pants for some of the things that they haven't liked or haven't understood.
West Australian taxpayers and voters have been forced to learn some sobering lessons. Because WA Inc. is about secrecy and lack of public accountability by government bodies. It's about the us and them mentality in WA and helping out mates. It's about government naivety and financial incompetence. It's about allegations of carpetbagging and corporate skullduggery, the depth of which is still being investigated by the National Companies and Securities Commission. And as the electorate grapples with real concerns, such as higher interest rates and mortgages, they've also had to grapple with the political cynicism of a government risking taxpayers' money in the vain attempt to make all the deals work.
The concern that I think most of the business community always had was the conflicts of interest that we saw, and I don't think anyone at that stage thought they would, those fears would be realised to the extent that they have been.
As Executive Director of WA's Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Colin Barnett speaks for about 4,000 member companies.
Now that a government, if it's trying to participate directly in projects, is not neutral in its activity, and in particular, it's even if it behaves the right way, it's perceived as not having a neutral position.
Brian Burke has just arrived in the study room here. Applause has broken out. Labor Party supporters are clamoring around him. It's a big moment for Brian Burke.
It all started with Labor's Brian Burke, a former journalist and Catholic father of 6, who swept to power in 1983 on a wave of optimism. He wanted to discard the ways of the entrenched Conservatives and usher in a kind of pragmatic socialism, much as Neville Wran had successfully done in New South Wales.
There'd been this feeling that the Liberals were very much the party of business, and I think that had been seen to work pretty well. Things were being done, and I guess Burke was saying, well, there's lots of other things I want to do in terms of development of the state. If I can forge links with business, not necessarily the same ones, of course, maybe not the establishment, but with some high-profile individuals, then I can get some things moving in the state.
Burke's dream was to see WA's economy surge. He wanted the government to actively develop the state's mineral and resources wealth. He also wanted WA to be free of the booms and busts caused by relying on commodities. So the Burke vision of creating manufacturing and high technology industries was born. And instead of increasing the tax burden to do that, he would tap the entrepreneur's skills and make money that way.
There's always been a sneaking admiration for those sort of people here, and the state's had more booms than a 21-gun salute, and there's always been a few of these people in every one of them. Sometimes they appear in boom after boom, you know. Until this sort of episode, there was a sense of quasi-respect for these people. It's just a part of a frontier sort of mentality.
There aren't institutions here that are normal, traditional lenders, if you like, or investors in equity projects. We don't have the AMP, the National Mutual and MLC, BTs, those sorts of people.
Do you blame them for not coming in when you see the sorts of things that happen?
It's a difficult call. It's a chicken and egg. You know, what came first? Were they put off because of some of the things that happened, or were they not here anyway and therefore the other things occurred? And I don't know.
Yet the Burke and Dowding Labor governments aren't the only culprits. There's been a tradition of very intimate ties between government and business in Western Australia since the early 60s. The isolation and the optimism born of a small population who control massive riches in the ground meant that Sir Charles Court's regime got into bed with mining companies, property developers, share market players. Brian Burke and Labor simply wanted to play the same game. The difference was that Labor played by the fast and pretty loose rules of the entrepreneurs rather than by their own rules.
Certain structures were set up, and I think there was conflicts of interest emerged. And ultimately, I think a lot of the people employed in government agencies were found to be babes in the woods. They were dealing in a level of corporate activity that simply they weren't capable of matching, and things started to go wrong.
Those structures began with the John Curtin Foundation, the ALP fundraising outfit set up by Burke in October '84. Laurie Connell, also involved in the Bjelke-Petersen Foundation in Queensland, joined Alan Bond, Dallas Dempster, John Roberts of Multiplex Constructions, Kevin Parry and John Horgan in the foundation. Sir Ernest Lestier was its only old money patron. Meanwhile, the Burke government set up a number of agencies to do deals that could sidestep parliamentary accountability and hide behind commercial confidentiality. They were the WA Development Corporation, EXIM, WA Government Holdings, but the most interesting were the State Superannuation Board and the State Government Insurance Commission. The SGIC was established on the recommendation of a report by Price Waterhouse and Premier Burke's mate, Laurie Connell. Also involved in WA Inc. was the Rural and Industries Bank and the State Energy Commission. And the deals created were legion. In the beginning, the government bought 5% of the Argyle Diamond Trust from Bond Corporation, $42 million. Dallas Dempster was given the exclusive right to build Perth's only casino and hold the lease for 15 years. In 1986, Connell and Dempster were given, at no cost, the exclusive concession to build a petrochemical plant. The Super Board invested several $1 million of state employees' super into the high-risk Rothwells. In the October 87 bailout of Rothwells, the government pledged a $150 million guarantee, and businessmen including Alan Bond, Dallas Dempster and Kerry Packer kicked in a further $167 million in a new share issue. Since that bailout, the Insurance Commission has invested $100 million in the shaky venture, and the State Energy Commission about $15 million. The SGIC also spent almost $800 million bailing out Robert Holmes à Court by buying properties and shares in Bell Group after the stock market crash. And the petrochemical project was bought back from Connell and Dempster by the Government and Bond Corporation for $400 million.
So all governments are ad hoc organisations. They only think of today's problems, tomorrow's votes, not next year's. And I think they probably were persuaded that if they just flung a few more $1 million of an instrumentalities money into something, it would solve the problem.
I think governments should never be involved in profit or private enterprise. Governments are custodians of the people. They're not the entrepreneurs.
Former TV station owner Kerry Stokes was one of Perth's business people not favoured in WA Inc.
Oh no, I wouldn't say we resented it. I mean, towards the finish, and probably the assistance of Rothwells was the finish, a lot of people became disenchanted with just how deeply entrenched it was. And probably most of us weren't aware that there in fact was that deep entrenchment, because a lot of people thought they were involved in competitive tendering at times, which ended up going to the same people.
Such an example was Burswood Casino. On top of giving Dempster the exclusive right to build it, the government passed special planning legislation bypassing Perth City Council. Dempster brought in the Genting Group from Malaysia and sold shares locally. But because of cost overruns, a corporate affairs investigation recommended that charges be laid against Dempster and others for not keeping shareholders informed. But 4 months later, the then corporate affairs chief, Alan Smith, reneged. Dempster had argued that such a prosecution would hurt his and Connell's chances of establishing the $1.2 billion petrochemical plant. The merry-go-round continued.
I think one of the issues involved there is, of course, that the people we refer to as a select group were very competent people in some areas, and obviously they were people capable of getting these projects done. Whether what the government didn't do that probably should have done was widen its inquiry to find other people with the same capability.
Pivotal to Brian Burke's vision was Laurie Connell. He looked like a Perth cowboy and led an extravagant life. He owned 400 racehorses, 3 studs, his own track, the requisite cars and boats, and he bulldozed 6 large properties to build one extremely large house. He was also involved in WA's biggest racing scandal, the elephant juice doping of several horses by one of Connell's trainers, George Way, who was subsequently barred for 20 years.
Stupid.
Connell's business dealings were no less controversial. Last Resort Laurie, as he was known, lent money from Rothwells to anyone for anything. Up until the share market crash, he backed more mining speculators and high-tech companies than any other financier in WA. In effect, Rothwells was helping fuel the boom.
Rothwells was the leading risk financier in the time. It got involved with many second board and high technology companies, took equity positions in those companies. It funded the operations of the companies, and it on some occasions took management roles in those companies.
An example of a Connell-backed company was Artec Videos. Artec was launched on Perth's second board, the stock market for smaller companies. Chairman Laurie Connell and Premier Brian Burke showed more than normal corporate flair at the launch. But despite the show of confidence, it went into receivership and has a deficiency of $35 million. When the share market slumped in October 87, Laurie Connell and Rothwell's house of cards came tumbling down.
Panic set in, and you can understand, all of you have lived through the last week will understand the panic, sheer panic.
The now famous bailout of Rothwells came a week after the crash. Bond Corporation rallied business and government to inject $217 million in to save it. And Connell made quite a big deal of his personal pledge of $70 million.
I'm going to tell you that I'm in the same position as any other shareholder in Rothwells. accepting that I took the decision that I would personally pledge my assets, my resources, to make sure that Rothwells survived. No other shareholder was asked to do the same.
As it turned out, the NCSC alleged that $45 million of Laurie Connell's personal pledge was funded by Rothwells, the very institution that was being rescued.
The government is standing in this situation to ensure that the whole world knows how credit-worthy the Rothwells Bank is.
Apparently, Brian Burke didn't know just how uncredit-worthy Rothwells was.
Rothwells was nothing more than a finance company. It was never a bank. The government allowed, by having their own name associated with the rescue, that myth to be perpetrated on the people.
Rothwells could haul in charities, church groups and mums and dads' money because it had trustee status. It bought such a status when it took over a retailer in Queensland with 15 years' record of paying dividends. Having tapped those cash-rich depositors, Rothwells then lent it out to risky borrowers. Curiously, Connell tried to explain the near collapse as if he had nothing to do with it.
Probably the mistake that was made, and you get 6/6 vision in hindsight, was that we didn't allow enough of that money to be fixed for periods that were other than at call. So we were exposed because we allowed that end of the book to be too volatile.
What Connell neglected to say at the time was that out of $700 million in total loans, about $300 million were made to Laurie Connell and his associate companies. Bells should have been ringing in the government's ears. Before the end of the 87 financial year, Rothwells moved $324 million in doubtful loans off its balance sheet into a network of companies such as Beltec, Katanning Holdings and media portfolios, exploiting different balance dates. After Rothwells balanced its books, it then bought them back. The effect was obvious.
Rothwells appeared to be much healthier than it actually was. What had happened was that Rothwells had entered into a series of commitments to repurchase assets, repurchase share portfolios, repurchase loan portfolios after its end-of-year balance date.
In the initial bailout, the government's pledge of $150 million of taxpayers' money wasn't a direct payment to Rothwells, but simply a guarantee to be used as a last resort. But the Dowding government's worst sin was that it continued to pour several $100 million into the black hole of Rothwells throughout 1988. And finally, in November, it had to admit that a staggering $100 million in taxpayers' money was gone.
I'm surprised the government weren't aware, as most people outside seem to be, within a month of what reasonably was the position at Rothwells. It took them some 12 months. That was pretty unacceptable.
It's impossible to understand because, as you say, they had a representative on the board of Rothwells. The managing director of Rothwells, Tony Lloyd, was the government's nominee. So one presumes that he kept the government fully informed of Rothwell's financial position, and that must have included information about the deals which surfaced throughout 1988, which were linked back again to this 1987 paper shuffling. So they must have known.
Do you think in the end the government have just been totally incompetent and naive?
They had made a huge error of judgment. They then did the most unacceptable commercial judgment of continuing. I mean, the most difficult decision to make commercially is when to take a loss.
And the government might be in for another loss when the provisional liquidator, Ian Ferrier, takes action in the Queensland Supreme Court this week, which will put at risk the government's $150 million guarantee. That guarantee was supposed to be retired when the Dowding government paid $175 million for its stake in the proposed petrochemical project. Bond Corporation contributed $225 million. Effectively, it was the second attempt to save Rothwells.
I don't want anyone to think or assume it's a question of bailing out. The benefits are on the side of the state.
Whether the project eventually succeeds for WA, it'll be years before the community feels any benefits because the government paid so much money for what is still only a proposal.
Some preparatory work was carried out on the site at Kwinana, Some work was carried out with regard to engineering design and so forth. Contracts were entered into, and some sales contracts were secured. But that hardly adds up to $400 million.
It's a typical WA Inc. deal, where the government forked out taxpayers' money for a development right it had previously given away for free to two of its most favoured sons, Laurie Connell and Dallas Dempster.
Well, I think probably the government paid far too much to get into the petrochemical plant, but that was a product of their eagerness to get Rothwells out of the way. I think it's a good project, but I don't think the government should be in it.
As the election loomed closer, Peter Dowding and Labor tried to shift the issues to more mundane enticement to voters. No one seemed to care or listen too hard. Dowding couldn't escape the damaging and all too obvious impact on the electorate of the past 6 years. Even though at the helm for only 12 months, he left the hard decisions to cut the ties with business till too late. Even Bob Hawke couldn't avoid facing the only real issue of the campaign.
I don't think there's any doubt that all the publicity around that issue has been adverse for the party. I've said that.
The bleak past was continually thrown in Dowding's face. First was the Auditor-General's report, which criticised the SGIC's investment policies, particularly its support of Rothwells. Then came the report of the government-established Commission of Accountability. It recommended a complete rewrite of all the legislation concerning government investment policies. It demands full accountability to Parliament of government agencies and an end to secrecy surrounding the deals. Reports that were hard for the electorate to ignore, and Peter Dowding tried to clutch at straws in the final days.
I established the Commission on Accountability. I published the Commission on Accountability's report. I have said publicly and committed the Labor Party to complying with all of the conditions laid down by the Commission on Accountability.
Suddenly, future accountability became the issue for both sides. The Liberals had pushed the WA Inc. issue throughout the campaign, and McKinnon, wanting to reinforce his squeaky clean image, was quick to jump on the accountability bandwagon.
There'll be no WA Inc. under my government whatsoever. It'll be killed stone motherless dead. So there'll be a process of accountability. People coming here from the eastern states or overseas for that matter will know that once again they can deal with the government up front, no special deals, no secret deals, no favourites, up front with everybody treated equally.
In the final dog days of summer, West Australians will try to resume some normality in their lives after being forced to confront difficult decisions at the ballot box. As they take stock of the unravellings of WA Inc., they know that the entire financial credibility of their state is in tatters. Even so, perhaps the most chilling lesson in all this is that few people in WA are firmly convinced that things in this isolated, freewheeling state will ever really change.
Well, it'll change for a few years, yes. Give it 5 or 10 years and the caution and the prudence will wear off and everyone will see the quick dollar and we'll be back. The next generation, there'll be another generation that'll do the same.
The Labyrinth of WA Inc., reported by Helen Dalley, producer Peter Hiscock. And with Labor likely to retain government in Western Australia, Premier Dowding has given a commitment to end involvement with private enterprise.